what I'll what we'll do is we'll proceed to take up 2 or 3 more cases of research. And then we will go on and take up some examples pertaining to genetic interventions. Okay. This next case has to do with observing newborn care practices. And what happens here is that you have an observational study, meaning the researchers are there just to observe, to note down what happens in an East Asian country to assist in developing means to promote more appropriate care for newborns. So the setting is a community with a particularly high neonatal mortality rate. So the infants are dying easily at a rate that is higher than in other countries. So the field workers want to observe current practices in the households with babies that are less than 3 months old. Okay, so very young babies, less than 3 months. And they want to see the baby's environment, the cleanliness, the warmth, the care in clothing and bathing, the interactions with whoever was providing care. And the instruction to these researchers was to abstain from intervening. Okay, so that's what they are told to do. Just observe, take note of what you see, but do not intervene. Okay? And for this particular study, the researchers sought informed consent from the mother and from one other caregiver within the family. The first question is, do you think informed consent should have been sought from other household members? I mean, from what you would understand about consent. If people come and there are many members of the family and maybe some who are not immediately related to the mother, is it necessary to get consent from every adult member or just the mother and one other person? Is that enough? In this particular households, you might have an extended family, meaning you don't have just the father and the mother and the children. You might have the father, the mother, the children, but another father and mother and the other children, depending on how big the extended family is in each particular case. But would consent from the mother, imagine the actual family that you might encounter. Would it suffice to just get consent from the mother and one other person? You don't think so?
I don't think so.
Because?
You mentioned that the studies is to observe how the member of the family interact with the babies. So if other household members actually do interact with the baby, they are part of the study of the observation. And I believe that everyone will not be happy to know that he's being observed without consent. So I think they should have consent from other household members.
It would constitute a violation of privacy, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Do you agree? I suppose pretty well everybody agrees, right? What about the convenience? I mean, if you were doing the research, you go to this household and you say, well, we want to do research, but we want to get the consent of everybody. Can you ask everybody to come so we can talk to them? Is that okay? Might be inconvenient, right? Might be inconvenient, but necessary. Yeah. It might be difficult and inconvenient, but necessary because you don't want to violate privacy. And it's not just doing the actual research, but also afterwards. I mean, when you publish, you will be reporting the outcome of your research, not just with respect to the mother, but everybody else who is there. So you don't want to be guilty of violating people's privacy, right? Okay, so that's an important concern here. And actually, the document that is usually invoked when you're doing research involving human subjects is the Helsinki Declaration. And the Helsinki Declaration says this about consent. Each potential subject must be adequately informed. So each potential subject, not just the mother, but everybody else whom you might encounter and whom you might observe, regarding the aims of the project, the methods, the sources of funding even, any possible conflicts of interest, the institutional affiliations, where you come from, why you're doing this, the benefits and risks so that they can assess, and any other relevant aspects of the study. So you have to seek the potential subjects freely given informed consent, and preferably in writing. But do you think that's practical? In writing? Imagine you go to the household, and especially as a lawyer, maybe you bring your document and say, okay, will you please sign here? You think that's easy or difficult to do? If you imagine yourself doing this in Sinchu, you think you can do it like that? Ask every person to sign? No problem. Mm-hmm. What do you think? I mean,
I think it's impossible.
It's impossible even.
I think it's impossible to ask everyone to sign the consent.
Yeah.
Material.
Why?
Because of the budget, I guess. Because, and I suppose not everyone wants to do or involve into the research. So ask everyone to sign a consent document is, I think, in practice, impossible. Almost impossible.
At least it's going to be very difficult. I mean, I'm asking. I really do not know what the answer might be. That's why I'm asking. I don't know what the situation is, what you imagine you'll encounter when you get into the community. And it is important, although there is a requirement, the Helsinki Declaration says everyone who can be considered a subject, you must get the informed consent. But the usual question is, especially when you have a community research like this, is it really practical? Okay. And if it weren't practical, I mean, if it were going to be difficult, what can you do? And there have been actually many cases where, provided you can explain why it is impossible, if, as you say, then you can just get consent in a way that you can document. One example is when you go to a community, and I'm not referring to Hsinchu or some Taiwanese community, but there are some places where people, well, I know a place where people, even when they vote, are not expected to put their names on the ballot. All they can do is mark with an X and affix their thumb marks, okay? Because that's what they have grown up to know, okay? It's not that they cannot be taught. It's just that they've gotten used all their lives in that particular ethnic community that they don't sign their signature, okay? So it is even contrary to their practice that they would do that. Okay, so when that happens, anyway, you still have to document. You know, if you understand the legal requirements, you have to be able to document what is taking place, and maybe if you have a video recording, then that would be sufficient just to show that you really tried. Okay? Then there is a matter of people not trusting others, because when they sign something, it means that they're getting indebted or they're borrowing money. Maybe the only time in their lives when they sign a paper is when they're borrowing money. So here you come, you want them to sign a piece of paper. They think, oh, I'm not borrowing money. Why do I need to sign? Because all throughout their lives, they have never signed something except to borrow money. Okay, so there are those intricacies of relating with communities. Okay. So Helsinki Declaration says, preferably in writing, but if consent cannot be expressed in writing, then unwritten consent must be formally documented and witnessed. I don't know if there are counterparts from your experience of legal documents that you cannot undertake by having people sign. And if there are children, then or people with impaired capacity, then there must be a surrogate to provide the consent. Now, assent is something else, because in some cases, the child, even if he is still a child, who is involved, may not fully understand what is going on, but fully understands the pain that may be involved, okay? So, the child may be not old enough to give consent, but old enough to dissent. In other words, to disapprove because it is so painful. Okay? Do you get the point? The child might be signed for by a mother. Okay? The mother says, okay, this is good for us because this is a kind of research that will be useful for people in our community, or maybe for you when you grow up. But the child thinks, oh, but this is so painful. They're going to get bone marrow or something like that, okay? And it is so painful. So the child cannot say yes, but the child can say no. Okay? You get the point? If the child says yes, the mother still has to say yes also. But if the child says no, then the mother doesn't have to say no. The no of the child is enough to disapprove. Okay? So that's what it says there. A refusal of the child to participate or continue in the research must be respected. Is that consistent with what you know of the law in Taiwan? Or you've not talked about that yet? Okay, so we proceed with this case. The field workers have been trained not to intervene as they observe. So they've been told, do not intervene, just observe. So they try to remain expressionless, because if they are so expressive, then that might be taken as a hint by the people being observed. So they try just, to be poker-faced as they observe, while observing the various practices. Now, one field worker finds this particularly difficult because he sees the mother preparing formula for an infant using water that has been stored. In other words, it may be contaminated water. Okay? But that's what he has been asked to do, just observe. Then he observes the mother is about to pour water to prepare the milk formula. So she's concerned that the water has not been boiled and that the feed is much too diluted. Okay, too much water. So now the first question is it ethically appropriate for the field worker simply to observe a practice that she knows could be harmful to the child? What do you think? For example, would the question of negligence come in? Can you say, oh, you know what is good for them, so if you don't do anything, you're being negligent? Are you doing something ethically wrong if you don't intervene? Or is it okay? Or suppose you put yourself in that situation. Suppose you are the field worker or the health worker, and you have been told, do not intervene, just observe, take notes. Okay? Now you see the mother about to prepare the formula. Should you intervene? Diarrhea from contaminated milk or contaminated water is one, maybe you know that it is one of the common causes of disease or even death in this community. Suppose you know that. What should you do? Yeah.
In the case of the contaminated water, if I was the observer, I would intervene. Because I don't think it's ethically appropriate for the worker to see that the mother is doing something harmful to the children, to the child, and not doing anything to help the child. And but this might be wrong for his research. But I think in this situation, the observer can stop the mother from feeding that contaminated milk, and at the same time note that, for example, water contamination is bad for children. So I think in this situation, maybe the observer can still do his observation, his experiment, and at the same time avoid the children to be really harmed by the mother.
Do you agree? Well, you're saying that because I also said in the explanation that contaminated water is one of the common causes of disease and even death in this community. Okay? And therefore, when you say intervene, you're intervening, you're thinking, you're intervening in order to prevent disease or even death. Okay? But suppose you say, well, I will allow this, and then immediately afterwards, I make sure that the child is treated for diarrhea so that she won't die. Is that okay?
I see the point, yes, but I wasn't thinking about this. So I would restate that for me, I think me as the observer, I will, in case of, for example, contaminated water, it is scientifically proved that it is very harmful for the children. In such case, as an observer, I would put the children's health in front, above of my experiment. So in that case, I will not do what Professor you just said.
It wouldn't be sufficient to do that and then to treat later on, because it will still be harmful enough to justify your intervention. That's what you're saying.
Because I think in some case it is very clear that it is harmful for children. I think there would be no problem for the observer to intervene and help the children. But in some case when maybe the scientist or the observer has some wrong idea of taking care of the baby, what that person think of is right, but it was wrong.
I mean, if there is no immediate threat, it might be okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you agree with that, or do you think there might be cases, or there might be a good reason for you to allow this to continue at least for a short while? Can you imagine a possible reason, a possible justification to allow it to continue for a while? Maybe difficult.
I believe that only if you can to be sure that this kind of diarrhea cannot be fatal, unless you have no right to see the mother use the contaminated water to feed her children, because the life is unreversible. If you just watch it, you are witness tragedy. I agree with her.
Okay, you agree with her, and I take note of your use of the word irreversible, which is crucial in cases of this sort. Not only in this particular example, but in other cases where there is a possibility of some harm. Usually, you look for this particular criterion, reversibility. If there is a possibility of harm, and that harm, well, two things about the harm. One, it is serious enough, and two, that it is irreversible. Okay? If it is serious enough, then you should not allow it to proceed. If it is irreversible, then more so. Okay? So if it is not serious and reversible, then you might be justified in allowing it to continue. Okay? But again, the question here is to suggest, don't just stop at preventing research. Okay? Try and make it happen, but in an ethical way. So that's why you have the next question. What changes would you suggest? Can you suggest some changes in the design so that you can still proceed when you have something like this? Yeah.
Advice is the design shouldn't be just harm for somebody's health. You cannot, the design of the device should based on you cannot be harmful to somebody.
Yeah, but yes, that's cool. That's good. But can you think of some specific way of going about the research so that you can avoid harm? Maybe it's difficult in this case. I mean, it's really difficult because the thing that could kill a baby that is less than 3 months old is right there in the water that they use. So if you have observed that in this case they don't have enough running water, for example, this might be a community where there is no running water, and therefore the water that they use could be easily contaminated, then it is so difficult. The danger of death arising from diarrhea might be so great. Right? Anyway, we don't have to try to find a particular solution in this case. I ask this question just to remind us that research might be so important, and it is indeed very important in this case, that we should not just stop at finding something unethical and then not making suggestions. Okay? If we find something unethical, don't stop. Think of a way. Be creative. Maybe we don't have enough time now to think of a way for this particular case, but in ordinary cases, always try to find a way to make or to proceed in an ethical manner. Okay? Again, we go to the Helsinki Declaration for guidance. And what it says here, in medical research involving human subjects, the well-being of the individual research subject must take precedence over all other interests. So the reason why your answer has to be respected here. Now let me move forward to another example. Okay, the title here is study, a study of health-seeking behavior. By that meaning, the question really for them was, why don't these women return for the results of their pap smears? Okay, a pap smear or a pap test. Are you familiar with pap smears? Again, you're too young to have heard about pap smears. Usually you do this when you're of childbearing age, so you're not concerned. I mean, you're of childbearing age, but you're probably not thinking of childbearing at this time. So you're not thinking of this. But anyway, okay. The study wants to find out why women do not return to the hospital. They have pap tests or pap smears, but they don't return for the results. And these women have a presumptive diagnosis of cervical cancer. Presumptive diagnosis means you don't know the result, but you're afraid that they might have it. And therefore, you are so concerned. Okay? You get the point? Like, some study might be dealing with women who are in the sex trade. If you have women in the sex trade, sometimes you will say, well, there's a presumptive diagnosis that they have sexually transmitted disease. Okay? Just so that you can be sure. So you don't know for sure that they have the disease, but you assume for the sake of their health that they have it, so that you will be in a position to treat. Okay. So what happens is that the chiefs of service in the hospital, whoever is in a position in the hospital to grant permission, provides access to hospital records. As you may know, hospital records are regarded as confidential. Okay? So usually you would not grant access to those hospital records. But here, the one in charge grants access to hospital records, and from that the researchers obtain the names and addresses of these patients. And what the researchers do is they visit the patients in their homes, and they ask permission to do the interview, and also consent. Okay? They visit the patients. The patients do not know, just out of the blue, here are some researchers who come knocking at their doors and asking their permission to do interviews. And they are given the results of the pap smears. And they inform the women that they should return to the hospital for follow-up care. Now, do you think whoever gave the permission was justified in giving permission to use the records without the consent of the patients? You think you can justify that? Okay, let me go over that again quickly. These are women who went to the hospital. They were convinced that they should have pap smears. Okay? So somehow there were researchers who convinced them, or maybe community workers who convinced them, well, you are 40 years old. At this age, you should go to the hospital for pap smears. Maybe they were even given something, a small amount of money or some food in order to go to the hospitals for the tests. But after they had the smears or the tests, they don't return. They didn't return. They were not interested. Okay? But the results are there. So someone was able to convince the person in charge to grant permission to access those records, get their names and addresses, so that these researchers can go to their homes. You think that can be justified? Repeat, the presumptive diagnosis was that they have cervical cancer. Presumptive diagnosis, as I explained earlier, doesn't mean they really do have it. But they're not allowed to look. I have been allowed access to get the records, to see the names and addresses, but I'm not allowed to know whether they really have cancer or not. You get the point? Because that's also confidential. So the confidentiality of names and addresses is broken, but the confidentiality of whether they have cervical cancer or not, that is preserved. So it's a kind of compromise. Okay. Sorry?
It should have a different level of protection.
Yes, a different level of protection of confidentiality. So the one who decides says, oh, maybe it's okay for you to have the names and addresses, but not okay for you to know whether they have cancer or not. Okay? So you go to their houses, you knock, and you say, well, we're here to help you, but please go to the hospital to know the results. Okay? Is that okay? Do you think that can be justified?
I think under this situation, it shouldn't be justified because the patient has the right to know the results. Maybe they don't want to know the results.
Maybe they don't want to know
the results. And
Good.
this question just let me think of like genetic testing. Yes, some people would like to do the testing, but maybe some people doesn't want to know, and even do the testing. So if you force everyone to just, maybe they don't want to let you know my information, and they even don't want to do the testing. So you will just...
Yeah, so you're saying, while people may have a right to know, they also have a right not to know.
Yes.
Yeah, if that is their preference. Yeah. So while the information pertains to them, they have a right to refuse to know that information. Yeah?
I agree with him, but I was thinking of, because instead of sending someone, a researcher, to the patient's house, I think the hospital can just send a message, a letter or something to the patient and tell them to go back to the hospital. Because in this case, it will be a direct relation between the hospital and the patient. But I think that would be okay because the personal information remained in the confidentiality. But the patient didn't know that there would be a research. So if it is under a research condition or background, I think it is not justified for the hospital to give the researcher the address or personal information.
Okay. Okay, you agree with him about the right not to know, and you are making a suggestion that or that is based on a distinction between research and clinical treatment. Okay? If the idea is for clinical treatment, then you may go directly to the patients and inform them, and they still retain the decision making. They can decide whether to know or not to know, and you don't provide information unnecessarily to another party. The hospital already has that knowledge. It has that information based on its direct relationship with the patient, so that should be okay. You're not violating confidentiality because the information is already there, right? So you're just informing the patient. And if it is for the possibility of clinical treatment, then that's another good reason why you should proceed like this. If it were for research, then that would be something else because you're involving another reason for doing this. And you need the person's consent to do research. Okay? Well and good. The problem was that in this particular community, they don't have enough resources to be able to do this sort of thing. And that is why this group of researchers volunteered to intervene in behalf of the hospital. Okay? In other words, this was not a hospital that was endowed enough or that had enough resources to, on its own, get in touch with the particular women. Okay? So this was a non-governmental organization that was trying to help women because the incidence of cervical cancer in the community was quite alarming. Okay? So if it was quite alarming, they thought, why don't we offer our help? And if we offer our help, and which is what they did, the person in charge understood their desire to help. But was that person in charge right to do it? Of course, the fact that there was an additional motivation to do it doesn't necessarily make it right. Because they have their own rights not to be contacted, not to be, for the privacy not to be violated, and so on. Would the benefits from that intervention possibly justify violating the privacy rights of these persons? What do you think?
I think maybe just based on what you say, the people should just observe, but not intervene. Yes, but in this situation, they intervene the research. And they want to do, of course, they are nice. They want to help the patient, but maybe they intervene the research.
It's good that they have good intentions,
Yes, of course,
but
their
good
intentions
intentions are not
but
necessarily
it cannot
sufficient.
be justified in this situation because, of course, the patient has a right to refuse.
So it does not justify the intervention in this case. Well, it's. I would say, yes, that is correct. I mean, if you go by the legal provisions and the rights of the individuals, then that would be the correct way to answer. Okay. In this particular case, we just observed that the non-governmental organization maybe had good intentions and were properly motivated, but good motivation, good intentions will not necessarily justify a violation of the rights of the people concerned. They might have enough reasons within themselves to try to avoid knowing, especially if the treatment procedures would usually be expensive and would not usually be within their means.
Because I think we also have to care about the feelings of the patient. Because it's just like a surprise, but it's a bad surprise. Just like, well, today I told you got the cancer, but maybe it didn't expect that you would tell me this. Yes. And about money and about the melodies.
Yeah, the analogy the analogy with genetic information maybe is appropriate in this case. And when you have information that you don't necessarily know what to do about, if you have it, is a difficult thing to proceed upon. If you don't have the money to pay for the medical services that might be necessary, then all the more you don't have a reason to provide the information just like that. Okay. Okay. I'm aware of the time, so I'm thinking of just two cases that are related. Okay. And these are not directly research cases. The first one has to do also with genetic intervention, and this is a real case like the others, and it proceeds like this. This is a case that happened in the U.S., and this involved a black couple, a colored couple. And this couple, each individual part of the couple, had a very bad experience with racial discrimination while growing up. Okay? And they now wanted to have a child. And they knew that they needed to have a child by in vitro fertilization, because they had tried naturally and they were not successful. So they wanted to have a child, they knew they needed in vitro fertilization, and they thought, well, because of our experience growing up, being discriminated against, why don't we have a white child? So let's find a sperm donor who is white and an egg donor who is white. Okay? So let's go to a laboratory that can tell us this is a sperm from a white donor and an egg from a white donor, and that's what you should have for us. Okay? So the participation of the couple in the childbearing would be in the surrogacy, because the black woman herself was going to be the surrogate to bear the implanted embryo. Okay. If you were in the ethics committee, would you approve this kind of in vitro fertilization and this choice of sperm and egg donor? You think it could be justified? What reasons would you have for supporting it or not supporting it? Well, it's difficult for us to imagine not growing up in a community where there are black persons and white persons. But, well, just try to imagine what it might be like in an American community where there are whites and there are blacks, and a black couple is going to have a white child. Is that a good way, a way that you can allow for people to ensure that their child is not going to be discriminated against? Yeah.
In this case, it's difficult to say that the parents did a decision which is right for the children. I'm questioning on if the parents can make the right decision for the children. And I was thinking of a question that because you're describing a condition of in vitro fertilization. For me, I think it's similar with black couple adopting white children. But is there any objection on this kind of situation? It's my question.
Yes. Okay, that's a good question, isn't it? I mean, someone might object to this as a way of proceeding with in vitro fertilization. But what you're telling us is, but imagine it's not IVF, but an adoption. If it were an adoption, we'd say by all means. That's what you're saying, right?
Because I think the difference is that, I think the only difference is that the children the mother is pregnant and she gave birth to these children. But if we consider the condition the children will grow up, I think it will be the same as black couple adopting the white children.
And in that case, it would be wrong. It would be wrong to oppose the proposal because opposition to it would be a way of discriminating against either the parents or the child, right? That's a very interesting way of answering the question. I've offered this as an example in many situations, and this is the first time that someone has come back to me with this comparison, which is a good way of looking at the possibilities. Often the reply would be, well, and let's go over some of the reasons given. One reason given against is, don't you think it will even be more reason to invite discrimination because here you are, a black couple, and you all of a sudden give birth to a white child. Then it will come as a surprise to the community. Why? This black couple, they have a white child. What happened? Is this really the guy's child? You would have questions like that. At least you would have people wondering what happened, and it would be a reason for them to not think of the child in a natural way. I mean, the reaction will be even more surprising, more unanticipated, more difficult to anticipate, right? So you'll have even more reason to think that the child might not meet with community approval. However, if you think of this not in the context of IVF, but in the context of an adoption, maybe it would be the reverse. I mean, it could be the reverse because the people in the community might say, well, it's a lesson for us, isn't it? That you have a black couple adopting a white child. They have nothing against having a white child. And this is a white child that needs adopting parents. So you have those positive reasons to think positively of the situation. But any other observations now? I gave that example. Because the idea was to use this genetic means, this means of genetic selection, to try to improve the kind of life that the child might have. Okay? And I wanted to compare that to this next example. The next example, another real example, concerns, and you might have, some of you might have heard about it, concerns a deaf-mute couple. So this is a man and a woman who are married and who are both deaf, cannot speak and cannot hear, okay, deaf and mute. And what they want is to make sure, again, they want to have an IVF child. I mean, that's what they need, okay? So another IVF child, and this time, what they want to ensure is that the IVF child is going to be, maybe you guessed it, deaf and mute like them. Okay. Is there anything wrong with that? They are deaf and mute, and they want their child to be deaf and mute like themselves. That means, okay, that means that the sperm and egg donor must be both deaf and mute, cannot hear, cannot speak, for several generations. See, they even went to the trouble of ensuring that the egg and sperm donor were deaf and mute for several generations already. Why? Because if they were not deaf and mute for several generations already, it might be not deaf and mute. It might be someone who could speak and hear. Okay? So they said, let's find someone who's been like that in their family line for several generations. Was that okay? What do you say about such a desire? If you were part of a community that had to approve or disapprove this proposal, would you approve?
Well, with me, I will not approve.
Well,
I think the parents, of course, they have the right to have the children, but they shouldn't have the right to decide what my children would like to do. I mean, in the parents. They couldn't decide, okay, I want that. I want my children to that. Cannot and mute. And because it violates their children's rights. The children should have the right to, how about, okay, this child's burned out and they don't want to be, I don't want to be deaf, and I don't want to be mute. But, and especially if after he grew up and he knew this situation, I was decided by, okay, your destiny is you have to be deaf and you have to be mute. It's not fair.
It's not fair to the child, that's what you're saying. That's what many think, actually. It's not fair to the child that he would be or she would be a deliberate choice to be deaf and mute, right? The problem with that line of reasoning is because this is a person who is genetically determined to be deaf and mute. This person, when born, could not be otherwise. You know, there's no choice insofar as this particular genetic person is concerned that he could hear and speak. By genetic determinism, he or she is going to be deaf and mute because that's what he genetically or she genetically is. You get the point? And that explanation has been given as a reply to those who say that is harming the child. You get the point? You're not harming the child because the child has no possibility of being better in terms of hearing and talking. No. You didn't make the person worse in that sense. You would not be harming the person. Yeah.
I just want to understand.
Yeah.
So you say because of both deaf and mute, so their offspring by natural will be genetically determined deaf and mute. So this condition compared to IVF, I didn't understand what you say by.
In this particular example, they couldn't have a child by natural means.
Yes.
So the child has to be a child by IVF.
Yes.
They're not capable of having a child naturally.
Yes.
Okay. So since a child has to be a child by IVF,
Yes.
they look for a donor of sperm and egg who is genetically determined to have a child that is deaf and mute. And how do they ensure that? They look at the lineage. So it has to be a donor. The donors have to have been deaf and mute in their family lineage for several generations.
So there won't be any manipulation in the laboratory.
No. The only manipulation is in the selection of the
So this
specific.
isn't a manipulation.
Sorry.
So this could be considered as a manipulation? No.
No, just the selection of the donors. Yeah. Is that okay? No one is being harmed according to that argument. Are you being discriminatory? The answer seems to be no. No discrimination because there's no chance of the child being otherwise. Are you harming the future child? No, you're not harming the future child. You're not making the future child worse than he could ever be because that's the way he has to be genetically. What reason did they have? The reason they gave was that, well, they belong to a particular culture and they want a child that they can raise within that culture without being different. They wanted a child who would be normal in that context. They do not have. Are they making a decision for the child? Does it make sense to say they're making a decision for the child?
Yes, because the child's destiny is
You and them.
But that is decided for the child. genetically. It is not as if they decide, well, this is the deafness gene, and let's transfer it to this child. No, it is not like that. In reply to our earlier question, no manipulation of that sort. It is not as if you have a normal hearing, speaking embryo, and you take away the speaking genes and replace it with the deafness and muteness gene. No, it's not like that. So you're not manipulating someone, you're not making someone worse off than he would have been. If at all, and it's still controversial, what you can say maybe is that you're making a decision to have a world where there is one more deaf-mute person than there would have been, okay, and one less normal person than there would otherwise have been. You get the point? You have a basket of all the people in the world, and instead of a basket with, say, 1 million deaf persons, you now have a basket of 1,000,001 deaf persons. Okay? So one more deaf person in your whole basket. Are you guilty of unethical behavior by preferring a world with one more deaf-mute person? Am I asking a question that gives you nightmares? I mean, this is turning out to be not a silly question, because recently there have been arguments by some philosophers that say this, that if there were a chance of making this kind of people instead of arguably worse off persons, then your responsibility is to make better off persons rather than the worse off persons. Do you get the point? There are quite a number of them, actually. These philosophers like John Harris, Julian Savulescu, and a few others who've been saying this, that there is a moral responsibility on the part of human beings to use, and this involves manipulation even, to use genetic screening in order to create more able-blooded persons than otherwise. Okay? If it were possible to screen and to choose genes of people who are reproducing, or to choose DNA of people who are reproducing, then there would be a responsibility. It's not just a matter of preference. It's a matter of moral responsibility, they are saying. A matter of moral responsibility to choose to have babies who are better off in terms of these qualities than otherwise. Okay? You have that responsibility to make this world, in effect, happier and better in that sense. Do you agree with that?
It's hard to say what is better or worse for the whole human species or the community.
That's what I would also say. You know, first of all, it is controversial to say that, but secondly, it is not easy to say what will make people better than others. Okay? I'm afraid that someone might say we all have to be taller, and that will exclude me from the set of people who have a right to be born. In the end, one might prosper better in the world if one were as short as I am than if one were as tall as, say, who would be tall nowadays? than those basketball players in the NBA. Okay, they might be good for basketball for a number of years, but beyond that, there might be problems. Okay? And it's not merely a matter of physical qualities, but also a lot of other psychological and mental things. So it is so difficult, even when you compare, say, being deaf-mute with being able to speak. It might be better to be able to speak when you're thinking of giving a lecture like this, but there are a lot of other things that we do and not just give lectures. Okay? For my wife, for example, it might be so much better if I could not talk than if I could. So it depends on the situation, it depends on the relationships that we have, and I agree with that point about it being difficult, if not even impossible, to just declare these are the qualities that people should have, and these are the qualities that people should not have. These are the qualities that will make the world better, and these are the qualities that will account for a worse off world. Do you agree? One can invoke, what's her name? What's the name of this singer who dresses wildly and, sorry?
Lady Gaga.
Yes, Lady Gaga. What's her, one of her songs? Sorry, yes, Born This Way. You know, Born This Way. It doesn't matter if you're like this or like that, because maybe you were born this way, and just being born that way might be a good enough reason to think that those are the qualities that count. And it's not a matter of what you have in the beginning, it's a matter of how you proceed in life with what you have. But this voice has been getting louder from this group of philosophers who have moved from saying simply this is preferable to this is your responsibility. It is not just that maybe it is good to prefer to be able to talk than to be deaf-mute, but that it is your responsibility, if it were possible, to make a person who is of this type than of this other type. Is it okay to end right there? I mean, we cannot answer all of these questions, but maybe I should leave with this thought. One of the things that we've been doing for Singapore is to help the Ministry of Education teachers try to find ways of answering these questions, because we have this program with the science teachers, and the science teachers are saying, well, will you help us find a way to help students answer questions about bioethics? Because they have science questions, and science questions are of the type where you say it's better to proceed this way than this other way. And we want to introduce bioethics into the curriculum. So they're not just talking science, they're talking at the same time bioethics. But we need to be able to provide the guide so that when questions like the ones that we have been discussing arise, then we have a kind of formula to guide people to try to come up with the correct answers. And, well, to a certain extent, it makes very good sense because a lot of people, when they have discussions like this, tend to get confused. I mean, confused in the sense that you have a lot of questions, but in the end, you don't seem to have right answers. And if you have a lot of questions with no right answers, I mean, it doesn't make you feel good, does it? I mean, you look like you're confused in the end. And it's not good to be so confused and you end up as if you have not accomplished anything. But recently, someone with whom I was discussing this idea said, but you see, the point is not really to come up with one correct answer, not even to have a consensus about what the correct answer is, but to understand that we have different ideas about these things. And that's the way the world is. We have these controversial issues, and we have different ways we come to the question with different perspectives. And the proper conclusion to reach is not so much to have a single consensus, but to have an understanding that we have differences and we can still survive even when we have these differences of opinion. Because we cannot always have a consensus. Not even with your boyfriend or girlfriend. You cannot always have a consensus about everything, right? But you know that you are successful if you have disagreements, but you can still relate well with one another. And maybe these are the issues about which that conclusion also applies. We don't have to agree on everything, but we can say afterwards, oh yes, we understand each other. And when we understand each other, we don't have to agree every time. I hope you can all nod your heads to that. And good night.